that would have been.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Our region, which is already renowned for its chefs, musicians, and artists, is now a haven for quarterbacks, as two of the best in the game will be hoping to bring us championships at the collegiate and the pro levels. We'll be looking at what's in the sports breeze tonight, as well as the Pelicans having a resurgence. Elsewhere, an investigation revealed how insulated judges are from disciplinary action. And with the new year, we will speculate on the business climate. Also, with the death of former NBA Commissioner David Stern, we'll look at the roles that two sports commissioners had in facilitating New Orleans' recovery. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, John Zimmerman, reporter of the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate, Kathy Finn, freelance journalist and business columnist for New Orleans Magazine, and Doug Mouton, sports director, WWL TV Channel 4. And Doug, I know you have a lot to say because you were saying it from the start. And we're gonna talk about our champions here in our midst. Joe Burrow, LSU, then Drew Brees, of course. We're heading toward more championships. Let's keep our fingers crossed. We're going to get there.
Well, we'll start with
time, huh?
Yeah, we'll start with LSU because they're already in the championship. Joe Burrow will go down clearly as the best quarterback in LSU history. This LSU team hasn't just been good. They have been historically good. If they can finish, if they can beat Clemson, and it's a spectacular national championship in New Orleans against a team that hasn't lost in 2 years, it's the perfect storm for a championship. This LSU team, if they can finish this, will go down as the greatest team in the history of LSU football. They've been playing football for over 120 years in Baton Rouge, and if this team can finish, it will be the best team ever, brought to us from a kid from Lafourche Parish. Ed Orgeron has done a spectacular job hiring coaches, letting them do their job, setting everything in motion. They got a little bit lucky with Joe Burrow, just the way the Saints got lucky getting Drew Brees more than a decade ago. Burrow has been unbelievable. It's been a spectacular season in Baton Rouge, and this team, if they can win by more than a touchdown, has a chance to go down as one of the great college football teams anywhere in the last 20 or 30 or 40 years.
Now, they have had state championships before, right? When was the last one?
The LSU has had 3 national championships. They had the first one was 58, which was the 3 that they recognized. Now, if you go back before 1910, there's some gray area. But the school recognizes 3 national championships. 58, which was Billy Cannon's team, Johnny Robinson, Jim Taylor, that great team that was unbeaten, and then Nick Saban brought a national championship in 03. That team had 1 loss, and then Les Miles, still sort of playing with all of Nick Saban's players, brought a national championship in 07. Remember, that team actually had 2 losses, sort of got lucky, got into the game, and then won. This team, for now, if you had to look at the greatest team in LSU history, you would say 1958 because it's the unbeaten national championship team. This team has twice as many blowouts, half as many close games, and to be honest, a lot more people are trying hard and spending millions on college football than did in 1958. It's a tougher landscape, I believe, but even if the landscape was equal, this team's been better than that. This team has been unbelievably good at an historic level, and I think they finish with a win, and I think they finish with a win by more than a touchdown.
And for most of the time, determining who was number one was done by ratings, by the Associated Press, and so it was really sort of like a subjective kind of thing. Only in the last few years have they sort of tried to create a tournament, and so now you got to a point where there's this day it's mano a mano. I mean, it's these 2 teams facing each other, and that's relatively new to the game.
Yeah, well, it's only been 6 years. This is the 6th year of the 4-team format. And 4 teams worked perfectly this year. The 5th best team this year, a lot of people want to go to 8 teams for college football. The 5th best team was Georgia, who LSU destroyed in the SEC championship. They're clearly not good enough to win a national championship. But the 4, Oklahoma certainly had some gray. But then the other 3, Clemson, Ohio State, and LSU were all unbeaten. If you had left one of them out back when you had 2 teams get there, which was the case in 11, the last time LSU got here, if you had had 2 teams in a national championship, you would have left Clemson out. And we don't know if Clemson could be the best team. They haven't lost in 2 years of the unbeaten defending national champions. So this year was a perfect year for 4 teams. Clemson was a little bit better than Ohio State. LSU destroyed Oklahoma. Now we get a national championship game with 2 unbeaten teams. it could be the highest rated from a TV standpoint in the history of college football. I suspect that it will be. It is a spectacular championship, and we get to have it in New Orleans.
Two great quarterbacks.
And two great quarterbacks. Really, Trevor Lawrence is a sophomore. I have a Heisman Trophy vote. Trevor Lawrence hadn't had a great year, but I still think he's the second best player in the country. I put Trevor Lawrence second on my ballot for the Heisman Trophy. I think he's that good, and then I had Joe Burrow number one, and it was the gap between 1 and 2 was enormous, and it's a great matchup across the board.
Okay.
Would you say it if you didn't?
Would I say what?
That you had Joe Burrow number 2?
Oh yeah, of course I would. Yes, I mean I think it's. Look, and I used to say that when I covered the state legislature, but when people made a vote, I remember they voted for a pay increase, and I was talking to one legislator, and I was like, "You want to talk to me on camera about it?" "Oh no, no, no!" And I said, "If you make a vote on anything, you should be willing to talk about it and explain why." Oh yeah, I would, but to me it wasn't close.
Okay, let's talk Saints right now. Drew is just looking great. The Saints are looking great.
And Drew Brees seems to have gone back a few years. He is playing better now than he has the last couple of years. Look, a couple of years ago, there was some talk that maybe age was getting to him. He's been better this year than he's been in a few, I think. He's getting the ball downfield. He's throwing it with zip. The Saints are the 3 seed at 13-3. They're 13-3 last year, too, and they were the 1 seed. You just got unlucky that you had 2 other teams at 13-3, and their loss was out of the conference, so your conference record wasn't as good. There has to be a tiebreaker. The Saints got unlucky with the tiebreaker, but I don't think there's anybody more talented than the Saints. They'll have to win twice probably on the road. I think they can do it. I mean,
they've been winning on the road, huh? Haven't they?
14-2 the last 2 years on the road. They've been a really good road team. It's a veteran team. They seem to hunker down in a different way when there's some adversity. That what I go back to is losing Drew Brees in Los Angeles. They spend a week in Seattle and then come out and beat the Seahawks, who looked unbeatable at that time with Teddy Bridgewater quarterback, and who none of us knew how good he was going to be.
Right, he helped get us to where we are right now. That's for sure.
That's the amazing part of the season with Brees out for 5 games, and Bridgewater coming in and winning all 5 games.
The Bridgewater story was just an unbelievable to follow. And I'll say this too, from being in the locker room, and I know this doesn't matter on the field, Teddy Bridgewater is legitimately one of the most likable pro athletes you could ever meet or talk to. So when he starts winning, and I do think there was some, I do think people got that. And Teddy Bridgewater went from a guy that first week we did a poll on Channel 4, who should be the quarterback, Taysom Hill or Teddy Bridgewater, and Taysom Hill overwhelmingly. This is before the Seattle game. Then we did, and then by 6 weeks later when Drew Brees takes over, the entire dome, they take a shot at Teddy Bridgewater on the bench, and the entire dome starts chanting Teddy. He went from, man, I don't know about this guy, and 6 weeks later to a folk hero. Now, he earned it by winning games,
right. Yeah,
but his rise is one of the great stories to watch.
It really is. Okay, this Sunday, Minneapolis in the Dome.
I love the Saints' chances this Sunday.
Okay.
I think the Saints are a significantly better team than the Vikings. It gets tougher on the road against Green Bay.
But no last-minute miracle in Minneapolis.
I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be close at the end.
Okay.
I think it's a double-digit win for the Saints.
Okay, great. Well, Kathy, we're going to go over to you, but do you think he could keep talking really for the rest of the show?
I don't know if I can follow
That's
up.
I'd love to have you here, Doug. Okay, let's talk to Kathy now. Let's talk about business. Business in year 2020 for this region. What's it looking like?
Well, interesting that we're talking about this today because just in the last 24 hours we've seen what's happened in the oil and gas industry, which remains a very important industry to this city. We've seen geopolitics come into the picture again, and we've seen oil prices spike today because of the attack in Iraq on the major leader, Iranian leader, military leader. And so prices have spiked, kind of pointed towards $70 a barrel today, which is pretty high. And New Orleans remains very dependent on pricing of oil and gas and on the Gulf of Mexico. And we've seen a prolonged period now where lackluster prices and just not that much activity in the Gulf of Mexico compared to 10, 15 years ago. And so New Orleans suffers from that. We saw recently the Shell Oil Company, which is the longest of the major companies. They're the ones with the longest history in New Orleans and the deepest ties. And And just this past week, we saw news where they confirmed that they were moving another 50 jobs from New Orleans to Houston. That dribble has been going on for many years, for decades actually, and it will continue because the real critical mass of those jobs is over in Houston. It's not in New Orleans. But and I guess the biggest symbol of that movement in the past that's happened in the past year is the fact that One Shell Square is no longer called One Shell Square. They lost their naming rights, so to speak, to Hancock Whitney, which renamed the building and took over several floors. So Shell is not left completely. Their deepwater Gulf operations are still here in New Orleans, maybe 1,000 jobs or so. And should there be an uptick in activity in the Gulf of Mexico, we'll see that come back. Of course, they're not the only company operating here. I'm just using them as an example of what's gone on. We traditionally have had the service industry here, the companies that serve the offshore industry in the Gulf. And that has been hurt because of the prolonged period of lower oil prices. And we've seen, last year we saw Tidewater, I think it was 2018, we saw Tidewater, a long-running player here in New Orleans that moved, was taken over and moved. And then more recently we've seen Hornbeck Offshore, a much younger company, but it had been a major player in the Gulf. And we've seen them in trouble. In fact, I think it was just yesterday they were delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. So those problems go on. We can't call that area robust right now.
Hospitality, tourism, that's still a major business here.
Boom, boom, boom. It just keeps going. It just keeps growing, and we've seen set another record last year, or in 2018 rather. I think it was a total of $9 billion in spending that the state had released those figures. We're seeing it grow. We're seeing more and more people coming all the time. We've seen it at the airport and the airport numbers as well, emplanements and so forth. I think one thing that's going on there is we've kind of reached a point where there is a little bit of a tipping point, and a lot of cities, major tourism destinations around the world and around the country, are kind of looking again about how many tourists are too many tourists. And when you have sensitive areas like the French Quarter and the riverfront of New Orleans, how many can we really sustain and maintain the assets that are drawing these people here?
And not overstress these assets.
And not overstress them. I think a recent example of that is we've seen it on the riverfront. I guess you kind of have to go back to the days when there was not a Waldenburg Park, when the only place you could really see the riverfront, and really the only place where just a visitor could go and sit by the water, was the Moonwalk, that little stretch right down there at the French Quarter. And then, lo and behold, they built Waldenburg Park, the above-ground park, and now it's a promenade that just really draws many, many people all the time. The city saw it become so popular that they extended it down to the Crescent Park downriver. So you've got the tremendous promenade there now. A big draw for tourists to go and see the commerce on the river, have weddings and so forth. But then you have riverboats proliferating there, and that's going to get in the way.
On the other hand, people say, look, this is a waterfront. You're supposed to have ships on the waterfront.
Yeah, but they don't want them blocking the view. Is mainly the
and
problem.
we have to move on to John, but I do want you to touch real quick also port activity. I mean, port is still a major part of our
The port has done
commerce here.
very well, and it continues to grow. And I think in the last year we saw them set a record with container cargo down at the Napoleon Avenue Wharf. They are growing and they are expanding their capacity with new gantry cranes down there to handle the traffic. So I think you can look for that to continue. They have been hurt a little bit by the tariffs that went into effect this past year. The steel import industry has been hurt somewhat by that, and the port felt that. So, should there be more tariffs, you could see some additional impact there, but in general, they're doing well.
Okay, we'll look to a good 2020. Thanks a lot, Kathy. John, over to you. You guys over at the paper have continued a series on looking into the lack of transparency regarding judges and complaints filed against judges, and even maybe action taken against judges before they go up for re-election, and voters don't know anything about it. So what are you all uncovering?
Well, like you said, my colleague Andrea Gallo and I have been working for several months on a series of stories. It started out with Supreme Court Justice Jefferson Hughes, who was elected up the judicial ladder, though he had some complaints in his past and an FBI investigation into his handling of a domestic matter from 20 years ago, and proceeded to look at, this process for disciplining judges and how much takes place behind closed doors with the Judiciary Commission, and all of this is secret until the point where the Judiciary Commission asked the Louisiana Supreme Court to act on a judge and impose a public form of discipline. That happens so rarely. Our latest story shows that it has happened 14 times total in the last 10 years that a case has even gotten that far. Only one judge has been removed from the bench. And so our story looks at why that is, why so few cases get to the public eye, that where people can look, but voters, and this is a state where we elect all our judges, and where people can look and say,
to
what
have
are these
more information
complaints?
about these people who actually are on the bench. So you mentioned Judiciary Commission. That's where the complaints go to first. Who sits on that commission?
Well, they're all people appointed by. Well, 3 of them are that's 9 members. 3 are appointed by the Supreme Court. 3 are appointed by an association of appeals court judges. 3 are appointed by an association of district court judges.
So
they're all judge appointed. They're not all judges on that commission. 3 are judges, 3 are attorneys, and 3 are lay people.
But they're appointed by judges.
Correct.
To oversee judges.
And that's not the case in every state. Yeah.
Okay. So it's also, as you said, there just one judge over 10 years has been removed. And
Joan Bench,
did the story with her, and there's some, she disputes it. But there's like only 2% or so of all complaints that actually go before the commission or up to the Supreme Court?
There over that 10-year span have been thousands of complaints against judges. Most of those complaints, according to the people, former Judiciary Commission members, are bogus. They're sort of outside the scope of what the commission even looks at, or they're based on a decision that somebody didn't like, But there are hundreds over that time period that the Judiciary Commission has said, hey, we need to look at this further. Let's open an investigation. And there are many, and scores at least of charges that have actually been filed, and that process remains secret for years after that while while a judge gets reelected.
Does the Supreme Court always follow the recommendation of the commission?
They do not. Half the time they don't. And in most of those cases, they reduce the recommended punishment. And so that's all. And that's a whole other hearing. You have a hearing before the Supreme Court.
So what's the remedy for this? I know there are those who say that we need to have this information, all of it coming out before the public, and those who argue against it saying, no, we just really can't have any kind of complaint out before the public. It just may not be fair. How do you balance that?
The judges are concerned that upcoming election, there's going to be a dump of complaints to the Judiciary Commission about, if it's by lawyers, they have ethical obligations themselves if they're the ones filing the complaints. But that's the big fear. When in attorney discipline, once the charge is filed, by the ODC, the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, that becomes public. In the case of judges, it's way further along in the process, and as you can see, way fewer cases actually rise to the public
In all of your research and the folks you talked to, have you seen that there's a move at all to at least lift this curtain a little bit?
Well, there's sort of 2 angles. There's the Supreme Court, and they have their own rules. They can change their rules, and they did after our series started running. They did, in fact, change their rules last fall to say that once a complaint has been resolved and is closed, then the people involved can actually talk about it. Before, you could never talk about the complaint ever, they told you. So that's sort of a piece of it. They could do other action. There's a movement in the legislature, and you're probably going to see legislation this year trying to open up the secrecy, the complaint process from that end. And there's a separation of powers issues that I'm sure are going to come up in this process. But I think you will see that in the session.
We'll be hearing more about it. All right, John, thanks a lot. E, over to you. A couple of commissioners really did help, sports commissioners, help in our city's recovery.
Yeah, when David Stern died this week, the commissioner of the NBA, it reminded me about his story, what he did with now the Pelicans. I mean, the franchise wouldn't survive here, wouldn't be here had it not been for him. And that reminded me of Paul Tagliabue with the NFL, which is an incredible story in terms of saving the Saints. And so we have two examples of commissioners who stepped in with a lot of authority and really saved the franchises. In the case of Stern, the basketball franchise was always a bit of a shaky enterprise to begin with. The Hornets weren't doing all that well in New Orleans, but he stood by him. He gave him an all-star game. I don't think this would have been his first choice to come. The owner of the Hornets, Mr. Shin, wanted to go to another city because, as happens with a lot of franchises, they had an old, outdated playing facility, and the local support wasn't there to build a new facility. So they said, we're going somewhere. In New Orleans, they just built this new arena, and they went after him. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. About if you build it, they'll come. And it's not always automatic, but this time it worked out, and so they came. But from the beginning, it didn't do all that well in terms of attendance, but he stood by it. And then lo and behold comes Katrina, and the arena is damaged, and the franchise has nowhere to go. And here's where he has influence on actually two cities, because he's the one who transferred the Hornets to Oklahoma City, which had been winning a franchise. They too had built an arena and had no team, and so they went there. What was supposed to be temporary. They wound up staying there 2 years and were very, very successful. And so Oklahoma City, better than New Orleans, proved its ability to support NBA. And as it happened, I know I for one was concerned that the Hornets weren't going to come back, that they were going to stay in Oklahoma City. But Seattle was having the same kind of problem. They had a team with an old facility, and people said, no, we're not going to pay for a new facility. And so they moved the Seattle team to Oklahoma City, which opened up bringing the Hornets back to New Orleans. And again, he stood by him. And then a couple of years after that, the franchise went into bankruptcy. There was a season or two where actually the NBA really ran the Hornets franchise. I mean, Paul Tagliabue was the guy who was running the Hornets for a while. Again, he stepped by.
Tagliabue's NFL.
I think the most brilliant move he made among many, and at the first it was kind of like, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, was when he picked up the phone and he called Tom Benson and asked Tom Benson if he'd buy the franchise. Benson, by all accounts, at the beginning had been sort of hostile to the idea of having an NBA franchise, but when he called it in, and I think once Benson agreed, that gave it a lot of security. I know, Kathy, that you covered Tom Benson. And
yeah, I think that it's interesting you're talking about both of those commissioners, because I really think when David Stern, first of all, when he had the league take over the team in order to keep it in New Orleans, after George Shinn decided to sell it and so forth, I think that was perhaps sparked by Tagliabue's move with the Saints, when he was absolutely committed to keeping that team in New Orleans. And I think Stern probably saw that whole story, and it was a big story at the time, and what might have happened in New Orleans if that team had left. He didn't want the NBA to be in that same position, and I think that was part of what spurred him to take over that team and to hold on to it. And then as far as calling up Tom Benson, I think one thing that was happening was behind the scenes, Gail Benson, Tom's wife, really wanted him to buy the Pelicans and thought that it'd be a great idea. So she was in favor of it from the word go. And then I think what happened is that Stern agreed to work with the state on the terms that Benson would get, or the next buyer would get, on as far as concessions at the stadium, at the arena, and so forth, which is always on his list.
Let's quickly, because we're starting to run out of time, touch on Tagliabue and his role in keeping the Saints here.
Yeah, Tagliabue is the reason that the team remained in New Orleans after Katrina, because there was very strong. Benson was leaning, as we know, he went temporarily to San Antonio with the team. He had to go somewhere, but I'm sure remember that the rumors began to fly that he was going to make it a permanent departure from New Orleans.
I've heard several accounts of business people and community leaders who were at that meeting when Benson wanted to sell, and Tagliabue was there, and Tagliabue says, in effect, you're not moving the team. The team's going to stay here, and so
exactly, he put his foot down.
He actually made a difference. He also set up the possibility, the chain of events for the team to come back and to play their first few games on the road because the stadium wasn't right, and to have their opening game the fourth weekend on Monday Night Football, and have that game, and that's the game that'll always be remembered as the Steve Gleason game.
Right.
And Tagliabue was the one who worked with Kathleen Blanco, the governor at the time, who to insist on getting the the Superdome repaired, and not only repaired but upgraded so that Benson
And we should
would have
mention,
it
we're
played.
working behind the scenes with Tagliabue, with Roger Goodell, who's like the deputy, who's been much maligned in New Orleans, but who was also part of a
And
heroic effort
present-day
at that
NFL
time.
commissioner. Okay, let's move this conversation back over to Doug right now. And we've been talking about David Stern in his role of New Orleans in the NBA. We do have now the Pelicans, change from the Hornets to the Pelicans. They've had a rough season so far, but they're making a comeback.
Well, yeah, they won 4 straight as of this taping. Look, I still feel the same way about this team that I felt before the season. They're young, and look, it's hard at 18 and 19-year-old kids against 25 to 30-year-old grown-ups. And in the NBA, you see that. The Pelicans got back Derek Favors. To me, they've been getting pushed around too much. Derek Favors is their big guy underneath who's helped. When Zion Williamson comes back, just because of his size, I think he'll help too. The team's still 12 games under 500. There's still a long shot for the playoffs. They are playing significantly better. I still love the pieces they put in place for the future. I never thought this was going to be a playoff team this year, maybe not next year either. But in the NBA, you build long term. LeBron James went to his first NBA Final Four in his 4th NBA season, and he's the quickest. It took Steph Curry 6 years to get to a conference championship game. Zion's not going to get there in year 1. The goal is to build for 3 or 4 years from now, and I love what they put in place long term.
Is he back at practice now?
He is, but we don't know when the debut is going to be. It's still a lot of gray there, but it's coming, and it's coming in the not too distant future.
I was listening to radio this morning and quoting someone saying, don't let him even play. Redshirt him?
No,
is that the
I
term
totally
this season?
disagree. The only way you get better in the NBA is against that competition, and you see it already in a limited way in some of the guys they have now. No, if he's ready to go, play him. There's no value. You're trying to move up in draft picks, forget that. Let the kid play. He needs to get better, and he needs to see what an NBA game is like.
And certainly the fans want to see him out there. The community wants to see him out there.
Especially for all those people who bought season tickets with the understanding that Zion was playing, they deserve to see him play.
Okay, we hope that he comes back good and healthy and really, really gets the Pelicans up on top. All right, guys, looking ahead.
Eric George was a local doctor. He's a hand doctor, but he's also a real estate developer. And today it was announced he bought the United Fruit Building on St. Charles. This is the building that was once the center of the banana industry of South America. Arguably, at one time, it actually controlled South America from there. It was a very powerful thing. But anyway, he bought that building, and no official announcement what the development plans are, but he will be putting money and making something special out of it.
Okay, John.
Well, we had a good year with in terms of the murder rate in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Last year we had a bad start to the year. This year on the first, and one particular killing, the one in Central City in front of the daiquiri shop, which has been the scene of numerous murders. The victim in that was a previously convicted gang member, and it'll be interesting to see how, hopefully police will be able to find out who did that and get to the bottom of a very difficult situation in that neighborhood.
Kathy.
I have my eye on the airport, the new terminal, and how it's operating. They've had their problems, of course. They've added flights for the college football championship, particularly Clemson people coming in. And we'll see how that works out. And, of course, not too far beyond that, we have Mardi Gras coming up. Right. And that'll be a big test for that airport.
Indeed. Okay, Doug.
Best sports story of the year is Ed Ogeron. He was not LSU's first choice, but who cares how your opportunities come? It's what you do with the opportunity. He reinvented himself in his 50s, played to his own strengths, hired great coordinators, let them do their job. He has done literally a spectacular job at LSU on the brink of history in New Orleans.
And go Tigers. All right. Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
Okay.
Watch